And African governments cannot put all their eggs in one basket, as many still do. So China is also the first bilateral provider of infrastructure finance, and is also the first bilateral debt contractor. So there should be a more structural reform internally of how African governments engage with China. So beyond having China-capable bureaucracies, it's also important at the regional level to have this very comprehensive China strategy.
Hello everyone, welcome to Development Reimagine's easy-to-digest video and podcast series, Africa Unconstrained, supported by Quartz Africa, the essential online source for understanding the forces shaping our world. Our aim with Africa Unconstrained is to explore African perspectives on the continent's new era, especially in the context of a post-COVID-19 world. If you don't already know Development Reimagined, we are a leading independent and Africa-led international development consultancy with our headquarters in China and with offices in Kenya and the UK. Our mission is to provide new ideas and solutions to deal with the complexities of global poverty and climate change. It's a mission our diverse team really strive for every day. I'm Yike Fu, Development Reimagined Policy Analyst and Researcher. Without further ado, for this session, I'm very excited to be here with our distinguished guest, Dr. Folashadé Soulé, to help reveal her unique perspective on China-Africa relations. Dr. Folashadé Soulé is a senior research associate at the Global Economic Governance Program at University of Oxford. She was the initiator of the Africa-China Negotiation Workshop Series and is also acting as an Africa advisor to the Commission on Global Economic Transformation at the Institute for New Economic Thinking. Dr. Soulé, I want us to start off our conversation with a number. If there was one number you think every African should be aware of with regards of Africa's economics in a post-COVID-19 context, what would it be and why?
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me. In terms of the number, I think that there's a general narrative. There's one general narrative of building back better currently that many United Nations agencies and also others, African governments are espousing. But it is important to ask, what is the point of departure? Certainly, we have to learn from this crisis, and African countries need to recognize that being richly endowed with natural resources does not by itself bring prosperity. And so the African continent is starkly energy poor, despite having rich quantities of renewable energy resources. And so I think that there's a greater urgency today to start foresight planning for oil reserves. And African governments cannot put all their eggs in one basket, as many still do. So I think that there are 70% of Africa's export revenue today that come from oil, gas, the mineral sectors, and governments must plan for a more diversified economy, an exit from fossil fuels, a shift toward green transition. They can go back just to drilling, extraction, trying to make as much money as they can. So it's also important to know that the low demand presents a big problem. On the flip side, there are many African countries who do not depend on these resources, but who might be tempted to take advantage of this. And I can use one example of Zambia, which is building a coal-fired power plant because coal there is now there in abundance. And on the other hand, there are also some countries in Africa who see that despite the unfortunate situation, there are a number of new opportunities to tap into. Countries like Rwanda, for instance, who are choosing to invest more in their green sectors via nationally determined contributions. Equally, Ethiopia for a long time has had a climate resilient green economy growth and transformation plan, which has been very pioneering in many ways, especially in terms of their manufacturing. So I think that Build Back Better depends on each departure point, and countries that start from a good departure point can reinforce their green ambition in a post-pandemic world.
Now, when we talk about Africa's economic future, it's practically impossible to avoid talking about the world's second largest, and in some reports, the world's largest economic, China. So I want to understand your insights on Africa-China relationship, and again, help reveal a forward-looking Africa perspective for our viewers and audience and listeners. So what has your research revealed in regards to the type of agencies exercised by Africa actors, both states and non-state, in their dealings with China?
I think that there has been, during the last decade, a surge of studies on African agency in global politics more generally, and also a surge of studies in Africa-China relationship. And this literature has allowed for a better understanding and critical analysis of the different ways in which African actors are using the various spaces in which they engage to their advantage. But I think it has allowed, to better locate, to better unpack, to better outline agency exercised by different African actors, state, non-state actors. But I think it's important to come up with a stronger typology in order to move a bit from the more descriptive accounts that are out there, in terms of situating agency in Africa's international relations and relationship with China. So that's why I think it's when you come up with a typology, it allows for a better understanding of the different types of agencies and also to see where they are more or less present. And I have an article coming up on these topics at the end of this year, coming up with this typology. So I'd like to, I will give you a general presentation of these types because when you look, for instance, just at state agency as a category, officially Sino-African relations are largely organized via government-to-government relations with a strong focus on presidential relations. But besides presidents, heads of state, you also have high-level political officials such as presidential advisors, cabinet members, just also they hold strong executive power by virtue of their positions in the government. And they have the authority with the president to make, enforce, ensure implementation of domestic and foreign policy priorities. So the first type would be that it's the individual agency by the president, and that is often exercised in the case of large infrastructure projects that are contracted and are funded by the Chinese. So what is by individual agency? I mean that they and I'm quoting here Yuan Wang, who has written a very good piece on this, and it's by politically championing large infrastructure projects that are funded and built by the Chinese. Some African presidents champion these large infrastructure projects, through exercising individual agency by intervening directly in the negotiations, increasing monitoring of the projects, bypassing the bureaucracy, sometimes co-opting opposition leaders, offering rewards or sanctions to induce greater efforts and generating a sense of mission in this case. So That's the first type. The second type, I was mentioning earlier, the cabinet ministers, the presidential advisors who carry out or who exercise some a second type, that is executive agency. An executive agency here is exercised. It doesn't only take the form of project settings that are executed by Chinese contractors. It's not necessarily in just China-Africa infrastructure project. Other expressions of executive agency take place in the way these specific actors strategically use the China model, the China development model in their rhetoric, in the way they would say that, well, we should emulate the Chinese model. We should learn from China in various ways. So I think that's also one way to see how agency is carried out. And in countries like Ethiopia, Zimbabwe, Tanzania, you have many African leaders that use the China model, as a common place to legitimize policies that they consider better for their regime survival, often also for their own personal interests. And where it's specifically located here is how they use the Chinese model to emulate the use of infrastructure in their development models as a key vector for economic development, but also the fact that there are no political conditionalities and the dissemination of resources to political without political conditionalities. So that's the second type of state agency. There's a third type of state agency that I call bureaucratic agency. And bureaucrats here are the actors, the state actors, sub-state actors that are more the low, let's say the entry level and mid-level bureaucrats. They constitute a specific category of actors that are different from the presidential advisors and ministers. And so considering them as specific actors who are differently located in the state apparatus, it allows us to see that the way they exercise agency is very disparate, is different and differs from the others. They evolve in a more constraining environment of state organization. They receive more pressure from the executive and the different social positioning of the bureaucrats. But still they do have a capacity to do, and you see that my study on Benin-China relations from the perspective of these bureaucrats has shown that they often exercise agency during the negotiation process, in the way they try to make normative considerations applied, the way they insist on certain norms to be respected, whether it's environment norms, construction norms, labor norms. Very often it's bureaucratic agency in the way it's exercised allows for better application of these. And so the second large category of non-state actors also has two types of agency. One is, it's civic agency. And in terms of civic agency, it's also important to know that non-state actors, they do not always exercise this agency in the same environment. Some are formal actors, but there's a whole larger number of non-state actors that evolve in an informal setting. And so in terms of formal actors, civic agency is exercised by official actors such as NGOs, trade unions, associations, civic coalitions, that come to constitute a certain balance between state power and non-state power. And in terms of the second type of non-state agency, it's the more semi-formal or informal civic agency that is exercised, spontaneously by various, it can take the form of resistance. It can also take the form of art, using satire, satirical art, as it was the case in Ghana with, the different cartoons to denounce the fact that the Ghanaian government wasn't assertive enough in its relationship with China. So these are the various types. Coming up with a typology allows for a more comprehensive understanding of the different ways by which different African actors exercise agency, but it allows also for understanding agency as something that is multi-intentional, meaning that it goes beyond oppositional and resistant postures. It's often inward, but also outward. African actors exercise agency to, enhance their relationship with China, or, to counter some of, some Chinese moves. But at the same time, they also exercise agency, to reinforce the relationship. So agency really goes here. And coming up with a typology allows really to understand that agency goes beyond these oppositional, resistant postures in its multi-dimensional.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Dr. Soulé. Now, while we know that every African country has had a different history and different economic needs going forwards, so how can Africa countries best advocate for their interests and the interests of the continent as a whole, particularly in the context of the upcoming FOCAC?
I think that this is a question that has come up often, and I wrote a little bit about the need to come up with a China strategy in an article that I published in 2019 on negotiating with China and what African governments should do. I think that there should be it's important to have a multi-level analysis of this. First, at the at the domestic level, at the internal level, and more largely at the sub-regional and larger continental African level. So at the domestic level, I think, and that is something that came out of the negotiation workshops that I'm leading, it's important to establish a specific China unit within within African governments. Some are doing it. I'm thinking of Ethiopia, I think Rwanda as well, but others aren't, meaning that China affairs are still led by a unit that looks more generally at Asian affairs. So they should be. China is Africa's first trade partner. So China is also the first bilateral provider of infrastructure finance, and it's also the first bilateral debt contractor. So there should be a more structural reform internally of how African governments engage with China. And so I think that there's a need to establish a specific China unit within the government and to ensure that the members of this unit are more aware or are experts of Chinese cultural specificities, that they also master Mandarin, as a foreign language, and that they are associated in the various negotiation process. And I think that is something that is happening depending on, some governments, but very often what happens is that, let's say one government puts that in place, but it's not enforced by law, meaning that when there's another government, this unit might just, be put away, or it won't be replicated. So it's important to have this structural reform on the long term. And now at the more regional, sub-regional and regional level, I've advocated, for establishing a China strategy. So beyond having China-capable bureaucracies, it's also important at the regional level to have this very comprehensive China strategy, in the sense that coming up with a framework agreement that brings together various actors from the African Commission, from NEPAD, to invite them to have these dialogues and allow African governments to better organize themselves. Because I think it's important to know that first, China prefers the bilateral way in its relationship with African governments. So that's something, there have been invitations from the NEPAD to Chinese officials to come up and set up a working group, but this hasn't received much, let's say, satisfaction, in the sense that the Chinese officials prefer either to go the bilateral way or to go via FOCAC. But it's important, especially before FOCAC in September, that there's at least on the African side, a sub-regional, maybe use the existing sub-regional frameworks like SADC, ECOWAS, to establish this framework, to have at least some discussions, some sharing of knowledge, and to come up with these, with some pledges for FOCAC and say, well, we've come together, this our common concerns. This is how we think that we could bring the relationship even further. And so I think from that level, go after that to the larger African Union level to come up with a more, China team within the African Union. Maybe that it's a mixed team between Chinese and African experts within the African Union. I know that there are some discussions in progress on these matters, but I really think that it would be something that will allow for the China-Africa relationship to grow even stronger. And sometimes these relationships they tend to have some caveats, or to have some tensions because of perceptions and misperceptions, one of the other, and coming together, using these frameworks, using ways to build, build common pledges, at least on the African side, allows for a better and mutual understanding.
Thank you, Dr. Soulé. And I really do feel that having Chinese units and China strategy in Africa countries, and as well as in Africa Union, is very important to deal with China issues, and also negotiate with Chinese counterparts. And so I think that should be a very important thing or points to be discussed in the next upcoming forecast. So finally, thank you, Dr. Soulé, for joining our session. It is very important that our audience understand what an African perspective is on these issues. So we really appreciate your speaking with us today. Thank you, and thank you to our audience. Please do follow us at www.developmentreimagined.com and on Twitter at DEVReimagined, and our partner courts at www.qz.com/Africa. Thank you all for joining, and see you next time.